This champagne is flat. Do better.
I'm very sorry, sir.
Sorry isn't good enough. Fix it.
The truth is, humiliation changes people. Sometimes it breaks them quietly behind closed doors. And sometimes, it forces them to become strangers to the people who thought they knew them best. On a cold October evening in Northern California, more than 40 wealthy guests gathered inside one of the most expensive private estates in Monterey County. Crystal chandeliers hung over imported marble floors. Champagne flowed without limit. Laughter echoed through halls lined with paintings worth more than most American families would earn in a lifetime. To everyone attending the charity dinner, the mansion belonged to Charles Harrington, a respected real estate executive known for his polished smile, expensive suits, and carefully crafted reputation. But before that night ended, the guests inside that mansion would witness something none of them would ever forget. Because the woman Charles mocked in front of everyone, the quiet maid carrying wine glasses with lowered eyes, was not a servant at all. She was the legal owner of the entire estate. And the man humiliating her in public was already standing on the edge of losing everything he had spent years trying to control. Charles Harrington loved embarrassing people when an audience was watching. Friends described him as charming in public, but cutting in private. He understood power, status, and image better than most people. Every conversation felt calculated. Every smile had a purpose. At 52 years old, Charles had built a reputation around appearing successful, disciplined, and untouchable. But behind closed doors, the people closest to him saw another version entirely. Especially Rosa Valdez. For 3 years, Rosa lived inside that mansion as though she barely existed. Guests assumed she was another invisible worker hired to maintain the property. Charles encouraged that assumption every chance he got. He introduced her as the help. He corrected anyone who treated her with too much respect. At social gatherings, he made small jokes about her accent, her silence, her clothes. Most people laughed because wealthy rooms often reward cruelty when it comes disguised as confidence. And Rosa never responded. She never defended herself. She simply stood there quietly, observing everyone in the room as though she were memorizing them one by one. But on that particular evening, something changed. Witnesses later described the atmosphere as strange even before the revelation happened. Charles seemed restless. Rosa appeared unusually calm. And sometime around 9:15 that night, after several glasses of wine, Charles decided to entertain his guests at Rosa's expense once again. According to people present that evening, he deliberately knocked over a glass of red wine onto the white tablecloth beside him, then looked directly at Rosa before saying, "Some people are born to clean up after others." The room erupted with laughter. A few guests looked uncomfortable, but nobody spoke. Rosa walked toward the spill slowly, holding a towel in her hands. And then the gates outside opened. 3 black SUVs entered the property. Security guards who normally answered only to Charles suddenly stepped aside without speaking. Within moments, a tall gray-haired attorney entered the dining hall carrying several folders under his arm. The room went silent as he approached Rosa directly. And then he said the sentence that would destroy Charles Harrington's entire world. "Miss Rosa Valdez, the board is waiting for you upstairs." For a second, nobody moved. Charles laughed first, though witnesses later said it sounded forced. He looked around the room expecting others to laugh with him. "Board?" he asked. "What board?" The attorney turned toward him calmly. "The board of Valdez Estates," he replied. "The legal owners of this property." Several guests believed it was some kind of misunderstanding. Others thought it was a joke. But Rosa's expression never changed. She handed the towel to another employee, thanked the attorney quietly, and walked toward the staircase while every person in that room stared at her in complete disbelief. Charles followed immediately, demanding answers, but security stopped him halfway up the stairs. That was the first moment people realized something was terribly wrong. Before we go deeper into this story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. What happened inside that mansion spread across California faster than anyone expected. By the following morning, rumors about the Maid billionaire were already circulating online. Local gossip pages picked up the story first. Then independent journalists started digging into court filings connected to Valdez Estates. Within days, reporters discovered that Rosa Valdez was not only the owner of the Harrington estate, but also the majority shareholder of one of the largest luxury land investment companies on the West Coast. Even more shocking was the fact that Charles Harrington had been living inside property legally controlled by Rosa's family trust for years without understanding the extent of her ownership. To outsiders, the story sounded impossible. How could a woman worth hundreds of millions allow herself to be treated like hired staff inside her own home? Why would she stay silent while her husband publicly humiliated her? And why had nobody around Charles ever questioned the strange power Rosa seemed to hold behind the scenes? The answers began decades earlier with Rosa's father, Alejandro Valdez. In the early 1980s, Alejandro arrived in California with almost nothing. He worked construction during the day and studied property law at night. Friends described him as intensely focused, disciplined, and unusually patient. Over the next 30 years, he built an enormous real estate empire specializing in vineyards, coastal estates, and luxury preservation properties throughout Northern California. Unlike many wealthy developers, Alejandro rarely appeared in magazines or interviews. He avoided publicity almost completely. But inside business circles, the Valdez name carried enormous influence. Politicians sought his support. Banks trusted his judgment. Investors followed his decisions carefully. And according to people who knew him personally, Alejandro's greatest priority was always his daughter Rosa. Rosa grew up surrounded by extraordinary wealth, but her upbringing was surprisingly strict. Former employees later recalled that Alejandro insisted Rosa understand responsibility long before luxury. She attended public schools for several years despite their wealth. She volunteered regularly. She learned bookkeeping before driving. And according to an interview given years later by one former family attorney, Alejandro repeatedly warned Rosa about people attracted to power rather than character. One day, he reportedly told her, "Your greatest problem will not be losing money. It will be discovering who changes when they learn you have it." Those words stayed with Rosa longer than anyone realized. When Alejandro died unexpectedly from a stroke at age 71, Rosa inherited control over the family trust at just 34 years old. The transition created immediate chaos inside Valdez estates. Senior executives questioned her leadership privately. Extended relatives challenged portions of the inheritance. Lawsuits emerged within months. And for the first time in her life, Rosa began seeing how quickly respect disappeared when powerful men believed a woman was emotionally vulnerable. Former associates attempted to manipulate her decisions. Financial advisors pressured her aggressively. Several longtime employees resigned. The stress became overwhelming. Then, less than a year after her father's death, Rosa disappeared almost entirely from public life. During that period, rumors about her spread everywhere. Some claimed she had suffered a nervous breakdown. Others insisted she fled the country after losing control of the company. Certain gossip columns even suggested Valdez estates would collapse completely without Alejandro. What nobody understood was that Rosa had stepped away intentionally. She wanted distance from people who treated her differently because of her last name. She wanted silence. Privacy. Something real. And according to sources close to the family, that decision eventually led her directly to Charles Harrington. Charles met Rosa at a charity fundraiser in San Francisco nearly 6 years before the dinner party incident. At the time, Rosa introduced herself simply as Rosa. No mention of family wealth. No discussion of business ownership. Charles appeared fascinated by her immediately. Friends described him as attentive, thoughtful, even gentle during those early months. He brought flowers to her apartment. Remembered details from conversations. Spoke about building a future together. To Rosa, exhausted by years of people pursuing her for financial advantage, Charles seemed refreshingly sincere. And because she hid her true identity carefully, she believed his affection was genuine. But looking back later, investigators noticed several details that suddenly seemed important. Charles became unusually interested whenever Rosa mentioned family property disputes. He asked specific questions about inheritance structures. He encouraged quick marriage discussions earlier than expected. At the time, Rosa interpreted those moments as concern. Later, she would see them very differently. The marriage itself happened quietly. No major media coverage. No extravagant ceremony. Rosa insisted on keeping everything private. Charles agreed publicly, though friends later claimed he seemed disappointed by the lack of publicity. After the wedding, Rosa moved into the Monterey estate full-time. And that was when the shift began. Slowly at first. Then constantly. Charles criticized her clothing choices. Mocked her reserved personality. Corrected her in front of guests. He controlled conversations during dinners. Interrupted her frequently. And over time, he began introducing her in ways that diminished her importance deliberately. Some guests assumed Rosa was socially awkward because she rarely spoke. Others interpreted her silence as weakness. In reality, Rosa was watching her husband carefully. Because sometime during the second year of marriage, she discovered something deeply disturbing. Charles had secretly hired investigators to examine Valdez family assets shortly after their engagement. Financial records later confirmed he had spent thousands accessing private reports connected to Rosa's inheritance. Around the same period, he began moving aggressively within his own company, using anticipated access to Valdez capital as leverage during negotiations. In other words, the man Rosa believed loved her for who she was had likely discovered exactly who she really was long before their wedding. But Rosa did not confront him immediately. Instead, she waited. Quietly. Patiently. Gathering information the same way her father once taught her. And the longer she watched, the more disturbing Charles became. Employees inside the mansion later described an atmosphere built around fear and appearances. Charles obsessed over status constantly. Staff members were expected to remain invisible during gatherings. Rosa, despite legally owning the property through the family trust, gradually allowed herself to blend into that same invisible role. Some workers understood the truth about her identity, but strict confidentiality agreements kept them silent. Others genuinely believed she was simply another quiet woman trapped inside a controlling marriage. Meanwhile, Charles grew bolder. He mocked Rosa openly during social events.
Very sorry, sir.
His sister Evelyn joined him frequently. Evelyn enjoyed humiliating people she considered beneath her socially. She criticized Rosa's appearance, questioned her intelligence, and once reportedly asked in front of guests whether Charles regretted marrying someone so ordinary. Still, Rosa remained calm. And that calmness unsettled people more than anger ever could. Because no matter how cruel the insults became, Rosa never reacted emotionally in public. She observed. Listened. Remembered. Over time, she also began documenting things privately. Financial transfers. Recorded conversations. Emails. Security footage. She discovered Charles had started diverting money through shell companies connected to overseas investments. Worse, she learned he was planning to pressure her into signing revised estate agreements that would gradually transfer partial control of Valdez properties into his own business network. By then, Rosa understood something painful. Her marriage had become a strategy long before it became a relationship. What Charles never realized was that Rosa had already taken steps to protect herself years earlier. Shortly after Alejandro's death, the Valdez legal team established layered trust protections specifically designed to prevent hostile asset seizure through marriage. Most documents required Rosa's direct authorization alongside independent board approval. Charles assumed he understood the structure, but he never read the agreements carefully enough. He believed emotional control would eventually give him practical control. And for a while, he genuinely thought Rosa was becoming isolated enough to surrender. But Rosa had spent her entire life around powerful men. She recognized manipulation more clearly than Charles imagined. The night of the dinner party became the breaking point because Charles crossed a line Rosa could no longer ignore.
Fix it.
Earlier that same afternoon, she discovered evidence that Charles and Evelyn were actively discussing ways to challenge her mental fitness legally if she resisted future financial changes. According to later court testimony, private recordings captured Evelyn suggesting Rosa could be portrayed as emotionally unstable due to her long absence from public business leadership after her father's death. Charles did not reject the idea. Instead, he asked how quickly attorneys could prepare documentation. For Rosa, that conversation changed everything. Because humiliation was one thing. Theft was another. But attempting to erase her entirely from her own life forced her to finally act. The dinner party was never interrupted accidentally. Rosa planned every second carefully. The attorney arriving with the board documents was intentional. The security changes were intentional. Even the timing of Charles spilling wine on the table turned out to matter later because Rosa wanted witnesses present when the truth emerged publicly. She wanted everyone who laughed at her humiliation to understand exactly who they had been mocking. And according to several guests interviewed afterward, the realization hit the room like physical shock. Some left immediately out of embarrassment. Others stayed because they sensed something much larger unfolding. Charles, however, refused to believe he was losing control. That denial would become the beginning of his collapse. Over the following weeks, Charles attempted desperately to regain power. He hired private investigators, contacted former Valdez executives, pressured mutual friends for information. But every new discovery made the situation worse. Investigators uncovered charitable foundations secretly funded by Rosa for years, hospital donations, housing programs for single mothers, scholarship funds operating anonymously throughout California. The quiet woman Charles treated like invisible staff had been supporting thousands of lives while he spent years chasing social status and appearances. Public opinion shifted rapidly once those details emerged, especially among women online who recognized the emotional patterns inside Rosa's marriage immediately. Then came the affair allegations. Financial auditors examining Charles's business accounts discovered expensive transfers connected to a woman working within his company. Luxury vacations, jewelry purchases, apartment payments. Charles denied everything publicly, but additional evidence kept surfacing. Soon journalists uncovered internal company emails discussing debt problems Charles had hidden from investors for years. Behind the expensive suits and confident public image, his business empire was already unstable long before Rosa exposed him. He simply believed access to Valdez wealth would solve everything quietly. The most devastating revelation arrived during preliminary court hearings months later. Rosa's legal team introduced security footage recorded inside a private office near the estate library. The footage showed Charles and Evelyn discussing plans to pressure Rosa into signing revised estate agreements after isolating her socially. At one point, Evelyn laughed while suggesting Rosa was too quiet to fight back anyway. The courtroom reportedly fell silent during playback. Charles's attorneys attempted to challenge the recordings, but additional evidence followed. Emails, financial documents, witness testimony from former employees. Piece by piece, the carefully constructed image Charles spent decades building collapsed in public view. Yet the most unexpected moment came from Diane Harrington, Charles's own mother. Throughout the marriage, Diane maintained the cold elegance expected from old money families. She criticized Rosa often and rarely showed warmth publicly. But according to later interviews, Diane privately despised what her son had become. Shortly before trial proceedings intensified, Diane handed Rosa a collection of documents she had hidden for months. Included were financial records proving Charles planned to leverage portions of the Valdez estate against risky international developments without Rosa's knowledge. Diane reportedly told Rosa one sentence before leaving the mansion for the last time. "I raised my son to value success," she said. Somewhere along the way, he stopped valuing people. For Charles, the humiliation became unbearable. Business partners withdrew support. Investors distanced themselves. Friends disappeared quietly. Social invitations stopped arriving. The same wealthy circles that once celebrated him suddenly avoided his calls completely. People who build identities around power rarely survive losing it publicly. And unlike Rosa, Charles never learned how to exist without status protecting him. During one recorded deposition, he broke down repeatedly while insisting Rosa had destroyed his life. But public sympathy remained overwhelmingly on Rosa's side because millions watching the story unfold recognized a painful truth within it. Too many people endure disrespect slowly, quietly, hoping love will eventually return. Rosa stayed long enough to expose exactly what Charles valued most. And once the truth surfaced, he collapsed beneath the weight of his own choices. In the final settlement, Rosa retained full control over Valdez estates while Charles faced multiple civil investigations connected to fraudulent financial reporting. But the most surprising decision came afterward. Rosa announced she would no longer live inside the Monterey mansion. Instead, portions of the estate would be converted into transitional housing and legal assistance programs for women leaving emotionally abusive relationships. Reporters asked why she chose that path after everything she endured there. Rosa answered calmly. A house remembers how people were treated inside it, she said. I wanted this one to finally become useful. Even now, years later, people still discuss the story online because it touches something deeply emotional. Not simply revenge. Not simply wealth. But the quiet way people reveal themselves when they believe another person has no power. Charles thought Rosa was invisible because he only respected what benefited him directly. He mistook silence for weakness. Patience for submission. Kindness for dependency. And by the time he realized the truth, every person around him had already seen who he really was. The strange thing about humiliation is that people rarely remember the exact insult forever. What they remember is who remained silent while it happened. Every guest inside that dining hall watched Charles mock Rosa publicly. Most laughed. A few looked uncomfortable. None intervened. And that may be why the story spread so widely afterward. Because deep down, many people wondered what they would have done differently in that room. Would they have spoken up before discovering Rosa was wealthy? Would they have defended her if she truly had been just a maid? Or did respect only arrive after power became visible? Those questions stayed with people long after the headlines disappeared. And maybe that is why Rosa's story continues to resonate years later across America and beyond. Because beneath the wealth, the lawsuits, the betrayal, and the public humiliation, the story was always about something far simpler. The way people treat someone they believe cannot fight back tells you everything about their character. Charles Harrington spent years believing he owned the house, controlled the marriage, and shaped the narrative. In reality, Rosa had been quietly watching every choice he made. Every insult. Every betrayal. Every moment he revealed himself when he thought nobody important was paying attention. And in the end, the maid they laughed at was never cleaning up after them at all. She was deciding exactly how much longer their illusion would survive.